Hello, welcome to Rising Technologies. I'm Harish. This is part 15 of Core Java video tutorial. In this session, we are going to learn about variable length arguments, that is also called as varargs. The methods we have studied so far had fixed number of arguments, and we need to supply all required arguments while calling those methods. But beginning with JDK5, that is JDK 1.5, Java has included a new feature that allows us to create methods that takes variable number of arguments. This feature is called as varargs. And a method that takes variable number of arguments is called as variable arity method, or simply varargs method. But prior to JDK5, variable length arguments could be handled by two different ways. In the first approach, if the maximum number of arguments was small and known, then you could create overloaded versions of the method, one for each way the method could be called. Although this works and is suitable for some cases, it applies to only a narrow class of situations. In the second approach, in cases where the maximum number of arguments or the potential arguments are larger or even unknowable, then the second approach was used, in which the arguments were put into an array and then the array was passed as an argument to the method. So let's have a look at this first approach, where we can create several overloaded versions and we can call these methods by passing different number of arguments. So look at this sample piece of code. I have a class Vararg demo, and within this class I have a method sum. This method takes two integers as a parameter and it returns addition of these two integers. But suppose I need to calculate addition of three integers in the same program. So what I can do, I can create another sum method that takes three integer arguments, and this method returns addition of these three numbers. If I want to calculate addition of four integers, I can have one more overloaded version of the sum method that actually takes four integer as a parameter and it returns addition of these four numbers. Now look at my main program. I have invoked this sum method by passing two integers as a parameter. So we know that compiler is going to invoke this version of sum method that actually takes two integer as a parameter. So this 4 will be passed as a parameter into n1, this 5 will be passed as a parameter into n2, and this method is going to return addition of these two numbers, and that addition will be concatenated to the string and it will print sum is, and that may be 9. Okay, so this is how we can create overloaded versions of a method, and while calling these method we can pass a different number of arguments. Let's have a look at this thing in practical. To speed the things up, I have already typed this piece of code. I have the class Vararg demo and I have this sum method and two overloads of the same method, and I have invoked sum method from my main program by passing three different arguments. Now let's compile this and run this. So look at this, sum is 9. So when I pass these two arguments, compiler has invoked this function and this function has generated sum of these two numbers. When I invoked sum method by calling three number of arguments, so compiler has invoked this particular method for this call, and the sum of these three number is actually 12. Similarly, sum of these four number, compiler has invoked this particular method. This method has calculated addition of all these number and the addition is 22. So this is how we can create a variable length arguments by overloading the method. In the second approach, in this approach we can create a method that takes an array as a parameter. Now look at my main program. I have encapsulated the required values in the array, and while calling this sum method I am passing array1, and this array1 contains actually three number. So this array will be sent as an argument into this a. All this method is going to loop through this array using a for each loop, and it computes the addition of all the values from this array A and it returns that addition. So let's have a look at this method. So instead of these separate method that takes different number of arguments, I'm going to replace these separate arguments with an array that is A. I'm going to declare a variable with the name add, and let's initialize this variable to 0. Now I want to loop through each and every element of this array A. So let's write for each loop int element in collection is array. Okay, so I need to say addition plus equals element, and after completion of this loop, that means after visiting each and every element of this array, I have added all those elements in this add variable, and now I can just return this addition. Now in order to invoke this sum method from main method, first I need to construct an array and I need to store the values within this array. Now suppose I want to compute sum of these three numbers, so I have encapsulated all these numbers within this array and let's name it array1, and while calling this sum method I can pass this array1 as a parameter. Similarly, suppose I want to compute sum, or you can say addition of some more numbers, something like this. Now I have stored all these values within this array, that is array2, and I want to compute addition of all these numbers, so I can pass this array2 as a parameter to the sum method, and this time this sum method is going to calculate addition of all these numbers. So let's compile this and run this. Now look at this. Sum is 15, that is the sum of 4 plus 5 plus 6, that's 15. And in second call it has displayed sum is 40, and this 40 is actually sum of all these numbers. So practically I have created a method that takes different number of arguments, but there is a painful job to construct an array first and then pass this array as a parameter. Now you may have used this application, that is Excel, MS Excel, and Excel has several functions that we can utilize. So Excel also has a sum method, and if you have used MS Excel, you know that the sum method within Excel actually takes different number of arguments. Suppose I want to calculate sum of these two numbers. Now look at this, it has displayed 9. Now suppose I want to compute sum of some more numbers, and look at this, it is displaying the sum of all these values. So the sum method within this application, that is Excel, is actually a best example of variable length arguments, because while calling this method we really don't know in which scenario how many number of arguments we need to supply as a parameter to this method. So Java also allows us to create this kind of method that takes actually any number of arguments, and such a method is called as variable argument method. So to convert this method that actually takes an array into a method that is a Vararg method, all I need to do is just change this array notation to Vararg argument notation. This is the Vararg way. You can declare a Vararg argument by preceding that argument with this try dot. Actually, at runtime, Java compiler converts this A into an array, so I really don't need to change within this particular piece of code. The remaining code will be as it is. All I need to do is change this A array into a Vararg argument, okay, and my job is done. So now look at this. In my main program, I can call this sum method by passing comma separated any number of arguments. Now look at this. Even this method can accept a array as a parameter. So in my first call to this sum method, I have passed this array as a parameter. In my second call, I have specified any number of argument, I can say comma separated argument, and this method is able to receive all these arguments in an array, and we are actually looping through each and every element of this array. We are computing its addition, and we are returning that addition back. So just compile this and run this. Now look at the output. Sum is 15. This sum is actually sum of these three numbers. In the first call, we have passed this array as a parameter. And the second call, I have passed around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 different numbers, comma separated number to this method. So you can clearly see that this method can now accept any number of argument. Even I can call this method without passing any number of argument. So let's change this call to something like this. I have invoked the sum method, but I am not passing any argument, and this call is 100% legal. So just compile and look at the result. In the third call to this sum method, I have returned this value, that is 0, because I have not passed any argument to this method. So creating this kind of method is called as Vararg method. So we can overload Vararg method. Now look at this. I have a static method. The name of this method is sample method, and this method takes integer type of argument, and I'm just printing the length of this array and a message that is this number of integer argument is received. I have created another version of this sample method that takes actually boolean type of variable length argument, and again this method is going to print the same message, that is the length of this array, and concatenate this string, that is this number of boolean argument received. So in these two versions of a sample method, I have variable number of argument of two different types. Even we can overload this sample method with a normal argument. Now look at this. This message is not a variable length argument because it is not preceded with that 3 dots. So we can say this is the normal argument, this is the Vararg argument. So this is the third version of the sample method. Now look at the main program. I have called this sample method and I have specified few comma separated number. So in this case I am passing some integer parameters to this sample method. Compiler is going to invoke this method. All these numbers will be passed as argument into this A array. Actually Vararg argument is actually an array. So all these numbers will be stored within this array, and it will say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 integer arguments received. In the second call to this sample method, I am passing few booleans as a parameter. That means I have passed true, true and false. So I have passed actually 3 arguments of type boolean. So compiler is going to invoke this method, and all these boolean arguments will be stored in an array, and that array will be passed as argument into this A, and this method will print 3 boolean arguments received. And now look at this third call. Along with these integer arguments, I have specified this string, that is hello. So this hello will be passed as a parameter into the message, and all these numbers will be sent as a parameter into this second Vararg argument. So this method is going to print first this message, and then it will say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 integer argument received. Let's have a look at this piece of code. To just speed the things up, I have already typed this code, so just copy and paste it. So sample method that takes an integer type of variable number of argument, sample method that takes a boolean type of variable number of argument, again a sample method that takes a string and few integers as a parameter. Now let's compile this and run this. So look at the output. When I invoke this sample method and passed 5 integers, comma separated integers, compiler has invoked this method and it has displayed a.length. The length of this array will be 5. So 5 integer arguments received. Second time I have invoked the sample method by passing 3 booleans. So the output is 3 boolean arguments received. Actually in this case this version of the sample method is invoked. And in this third call to the sample method, I have passed this hello as a message and few integers as a parameter. So this method has displayed that message as hello, and it has displayed 5 integer arguments received. So this is how we can overload a method that takes variable number of argument. We can overload with the variable number of argument with different type, or we can add some normal argument along with variable number of arguments. While creating Vararg method, you must remember one key rule about variable number of argument, that a method can have only one Vararg argument, and the Vararg argument should be the last argument in the argument list of a method. Now let me remove all these methods and look at this. Suppose I have this sample method and it has a variable number of argument, that is a, and I have one more argument, that is b. Compiler is not going to compile this program. Now if I run this, if I compile this, see, it is saying expected closing bracket. That means when you specify a variable number of argument, you cannot specify any argument after this argument, or in simple word, Vararg argument should be the last argument in your argument list. And why is that? Imagine if I call this sample method by passing these values. We know that all these values can be stored as a parameter into this a. Then what about this b? There will be no argument that is going to be stored in this b. So this is the reason we should store all the variable length argument at the last of your argument list. Now if I invoke this method, this 3 will be sent as an argument into this b, and all these argument will be sent as a Vararg argument into this a. So currently this method has b as a compulsory argument and this a as a Vararg, or can say optional argument. So while calling this method, I can just invoke something like this. So if I say sample method and 3, so this 3 will be sent as a parameter into this b, and the length of a will be 0. So I think you got this rule that a method can have normal argument and Vararg argument, but the Vararg argument should be the last argument in the argument list. Again, you cannot have more than one Vararg argument. Now if I say integer Vararg argument x, so again the rule is Vararg should be the last argument. So if this is the last argument, we cannot specify any argument after this Vararg argument. So remember these two key rules. A method can have at most one Vararg argument, and normal arguments can be any number of arguments. Again, Vararg argument should be the last argument in the argument list. Now we must consider ambiguity factor while creating Vararg methods. Now look at this particular piece of code. I have this sample method that takes integer variable length argument. I have one more sample method that takes boolean variable number of arguments. So we know that we can invoke this method by passing no arguments as well as any number of integer argument. Similarly, I can invoke this method by passing no argument at all or any number of boolean arguments. So when I call this sample method, and if I pass a few integers, we know that compiler is going to invoke this version of sample method, and it is going to say 5 integer arguments received. In my second call to the sample method, I have invoked the sample method by passing 3 booleans. So compiler is going to link this particular function call with this method. But what about this? If I call sample method without passing any argument, so compiler will get confused which method is to be called, because this method can be called without any argument. Even this method can also be called without an argument. So compiler is not going to compile this program. It will generate an error, that is ambiguity between two versions of sample method. Let's have a practical look at this. Suppose I have a method that takes variable number of arguments of type integer. I have one more method that takes variable number of arguments of type boolean. Now if I call this method by passing some integers, I call the same method by passing few booleans. Now if I compile and run this, see the output. First time I have passed 4 integers, so this method is called, it has displayed 4 integer arguments received. In my second call to the sample method, I have specified 3 booleans, so it has displayed 3 boolean arguments received. Now if I call this sample method and if I do not supply any argument, so compiler is going to show an error about the ambiguity between these two methods. So let's compile this and look at the error. Reference to sample method is ambiguous. This one. Both methods, sample method that takes integer Vararg argument and the sample method that takes boolean Vararg argument in the Vararg in the program actually matches this particular function call. So this is how you must consider this ambiguity factor while creating Vararg methods. Thanks for watching. For more details, visit our official site, that is www.risingtechnologies.in. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel.